looking for me is all it's doing. So no questions or anything? Okay. All right. Well, let me pray real quick, and then we'll get going. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this, for your meeting us where we are, for your love for us, in all the ways that we oftentimes take for granted. We don't even notice. I pray that you'll continue to guide us into a deeper understanding of the grace that you've offered us and the freedom that you've offered us. And one way to do that is to see where we're caught, where we're enslaved or imprisoned by other people's expectations or our own, or both. So guide us into that understanding and also just into trusting you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So as far as I can tell, we left off with this, and the way that we end up externalizing things is into what I refer to as silencing ourselves. A lot of times we will do the thinking for somebody else and then say, well, they don't want to hear me anyway, and then I silence myself. I don't say anything and then resent the fact that they don't respond. And obviously we can't respond to what we don't know. And in a lot of cases, shame very much kind of silences people. And I've seen it happen over and over and over again. Even in something as simple as just making a request of somebody. And it's a simple request, and yet when I teeter on the edge and say, I don't want to ask it, one, I'm not sure I want to hear the answer, and then the other part of it is I'm not sure I'm worthy of it. And we may not entirely identify that, really. I think our stance ends up identifying that for us and how we actually do things. So the other thing when we're talking about shame, it's about the idea of being exposed and our mask being pulled off. There are a couple different places where Brown is talking about humiliation and embarrassment and all of those sorts of things. And the idea here of humiliation is moving all these ruthless words and conclusions into the public domain and having them directed at us. I said this to the section yesterday. I think that probably the most difficult circumstances to be in is when somebody outside of us echoes what we're saying internally to us. Okay? So there's an echo. And if we sense our reaction to it, it probably betrays an internal kind of narrative that we've got going, and they've just articulated it. And now we're in deeper weeds, if you will, when somebody is actually saying it openly, and we're in more danger, we're under more threat. That's very much a part of that. So in a lot of cases for people, we will say, well, I deserve the shame I have because I look at my behaviors, I look at the choices I made, etc. But on the other hand, I don't deserve humiliation. Now, humiliation is always in the public domain. It's used to intimidate. It's used to manipulate the other person. Oftentimes, I get them feeling bad enough, and then indeed they will do what I want them to do. And I can use all the cards in my card deck of ways to get them to move however I want them to move. So humiliation is a little bit different characterization. And remember we said how embarrassment, I'll do something dumb and laugh at it later. And it's not used against me. I mean, oftentimes the person I'm with is laughing with me, not at me. But with humiliation, it's a very different story. And usually there is an intent, and we pretty much know what the intent is, maybe with the relationship we've had or whatever it might be with the person that we're talking about. So how we end up experiencing it is the issue in terms of shame. So what is it, and how do we experience it? Some of the ways it shows up, but how do we experience it? And the issue here is how we experience. A lot of times, let me say this first. You probably are beginning to realize that we confuse or conflate guilt and shame together. If you listen to any pastor, most of the time those two words are always linked. And what we're trying to do with this class is to pull these two things apart, where guilt is about my performance and shame is about my identity. Whenever they're linked is when a very toxic combination comes together. So there is this layering, if you will, of conflicting and competing demands around what we feel like people expect of us, what we expect of ourselves, and then how we're perceived. You've got three different things here that are operating in any given situation. And we get very adept at reading people's eyes. Well, now, I mean, this stuff with masks is really, well, besides terribly annoying. How do you read somebody's eyes? I mean, I think I've said this before. There are some people like, I don't want to be in a poker game with these folks. I would have no idea what was going on in their head with their eyes. But I just did an exercise in the class. Most of you guys have been in my transformational class, and you remember the strengths and weaknesses thing I have you do. And I sent all the students outside, and they took their masks off. And like, I have to reacquaint myself with these people. Knowing somebody with a mask and without a mask is something entirely different. And actually, that's a metaphor for what we're talking about here. Is that in some respects, we count on our masks hiding things that we can't hide. We can't necessarily hide a smile. We can't hide a smirk. We can't hide sadness. But if I can hide my face, namely my mouth, and all of the facial features that go with that, I can hide what's going on. And so the challenge here is who we should be, how we expect ourselves to be. And I would suggest to you that there is this extra layer. This is one thing that Brown does not talk about that exists here for Christians. And the issue of like for example, the phrase where God talks about, be perfect as I am perfect. And we read it in perfectionistic terms, when in fact what is meant is find completeness in me and be complete as I am. Or mature, would be another way to put it. But the perfect that is used often in Scripture is not perfectionism. That's a philosophical approach to life. But being Christ-like, we create this ideal, perfect standard, and then we're always going to be in a failure state because we can't measure up to it. Instead of growing into it, I mentioned before the whole idea of reformation versus transformation. And how do I move with trust and time and freedom to become more like Christ rather than be Christ? I mean, be Him being the measure for us because of what we do with it. The other one is just being above reproach. And ironically, the funny thing about this in terms of being above reproach is who gets to determine whether I'm above reproach or not, really. Because I can do something that in my mind is being above reproach, whether I'm maintaining a distance. I mean, I had one church that I worked at, and they had a standard. Some of you might work in churches and have heard this before. But the standard is that men and women don't drive in a car together who are not married. And so, how does that hit group meetings and things like that? Well, they drive the same gender. Why? Because they're trying to be above reproach. They don't want misinterpretations to occur. And it's managing perceptions, plain and simple. And that's understandable, but that's kind of what above reproach really is all about. We always have to balance our freedom with the impact it has on others. Paul makes that really clear in terms of, particularly in Romans, when he's talking about eating meat from idols. We don't do that anymore. But doing things that somebody who might have a weaker faith misinterprets, I need to be mindful of it. I need to be conscious of the impact it might have. And so the above reproach is another layer. And then obviously I think a lot of times people know painfully that I'm representing Christ, or I'm representing what Christianity is like. I talked to a former student. She graduated last spring, and she's at a graduate school in Georgia. And that was one of the things she was wrestling with is I don't want people to get a bad idea about Christianity. So she ends up being kind of tied together in what way she's going to do and how she's going to be true to her faith and at the same time welcoming to relationships. And that's, in a lot of ways, you don't learn that here very well. I mean, because we don't have to, right? I mean, we're surrounded by Christians. She's at a place where she is not surrounded by Christians. She's the minority. And how does she conduct herself in terms of relationships and things like that? And that's all very much a part of this idea of representing Jesus or representing Christianity or any of the other things that go with it. So who we should be, another one is what we should be. In terms of, what is a good Christian man, a good Christian woman, what does that look like? And that's really a part of how we define ourselves. Even from childhood, we've heard that be a good little boy, be a good little girl. And in a lot of cases, that becomes our identity. And we get sold on the idea that I can perform my way into being good, and then we drag that into our faith, even our relationship with God. So I have enough grace to be saved, but I don't know about grace for sanctification. I don't know about grace for living. So the last one is how we should be. How do I behave? What do I do with myself? How do I handle myself? I already mentioned that in terms of talking to the student last night. And that's a challenge, obviously. It's a big challenge that we face, is these different layers of conflict. So I know who I should be, but what about how am I supposed to behave, or how should I be? And those conflict because of how I define things and how I frame things up in terms of understanding them. So the other thing that shame does and how we experience it is just simply pure and simple, just fear. And it shows up in everything that we do, whether that's when we were talking about safe people. Being a critic, okay, remember the three kind of groups of people. Being a critic oftentimes is founded out of fear. Fear of how I'm going to be perceived if I'm not correcting somebody. So we're bent on trying to reduce these things, whether that's ridicule or diminishment or being perceived as flawed or being exposed in whatever way. I'm not the person that I create the appearance that I am. And it jeopardizes our connection to other people and our sense of acceptance. So the shame, that's the thing. Whenever I'm having a conversation with people, and I'm sure you guys have gotten sick of hearing me talk about define your terms all the time. But when we're talking about shame, let's be clear about what we're talking about. And because we've got all these layers, there are some layers that are more compelling to me than others, like how I should be or what I should be, rather than how should I behave or what I should do. So we experience it just plain and simple as fear. There's the threat of abandonment, the threat of somebody moving away from us, and all of those sorts of threats that are very much a part of it. The funny thing about it, and I actually did a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I entitled it Kintsugi and Brokenness and Acceptance and Grace. And does anybody know what Kintsugi is? Has anybody heard of that term? Kintsugi is actually an art form in Japan. And it's hundreds of years old. It's been around for a long, long time. And basically what it does is it takes broken pots and glues them back together and holds it together with gold. So the original broken pot is completely worthless, but when it's put back together and the gold lacquer is put on top of it, it now becomes even more immensely valuable than it was before. See, we have a notion that brokenness is always bad. We do. And we're doing everything we can to remove our brokenness. And I would suggest to you that when Paul talks about us being a masterpiece, it might be in light of what I'm referring to as kintsugi, a broken pot that's been redeemed and now made more valuable because of its brokenness. And that's the backdrop of what shame does. It reminds us of our brokenness. It does nothing to remind us of our redemption or the grace that is being offered us. We get lost in some of those things. So the other thing we have to contend with when we're talking about this is what I call the power of the double bind. And the double bind, the way that works is, and let me give you an example of the way that works in some context. The double bind is basically, you're probably familiar with the phrase, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. In psychology, at least, particularly in family systems and family therapy, we used to have an operational theory called the double bind theory of schizophrenia. And the theory went like this. It said that schizophrenics are more likely to emerge from a family that has double bind communications in it. And the example that the theorists that were proposing this used was a young man being in the hospital, having been hospitalized for a psychotic break. And he finally gets stable enough to take visitors. His mom comes in to visit him. And somebody is watching this interaction. And as she approaches, he is so happy to see her, he throws his arms around her. And as he does, she stiffens. So she stiffens her back, and he drops his arms and backs away, and then she looks at him and says, "Why, son, don't you love your mother?" See, there's no way out of that situation. He was expressing his love for her, but then she gives this nonverbal kind of communication, don't do that. He pulls away to respect it, and he's still stuck because now he's not loving his mother. That's the double bind we find ourselves in a lot with people around us and how we even deal with ourselves. So a situation in which options are very limited, all of them expose us to some kind of penalty or consequences. And that's part of the backdrop of shame, is there's no way out of this dilemma that we're in. If I go one way and I invite feedback from people, for example, and I get it, and then I drop into shame. If I don't invite feedback, I'm still left with my own shame, okay? And that's the challenge. It is the challenge if we want to grow. Shame is about conserving things so that I don't have to lose anything. And grace is about expression of freedom and gaining so much more. And so the one thing we know, if you've ever heard about the example of, the kid that raids the cookie jar, and their hand is bigger than the opening, so they put their hand down this way, grab onto the cookie, and hang onto the cookie, and they can't get their cookie jar out, or their hand out of the cookie jar. Because they have to let go of it, right, to get out of the thing, but they're still without the cookie. And the same thing happens to us, is that if we're all about control and managing appearances and making certain outcomes happen, we hang on very tightly, but that also makes it impossible to have the gift that we've been offered. So the blame isn't far behind. The blame is used to lead to these feelings of powerlessness we have. Obviously, with a double bind, that's how we feel. And then shame, it really is hard to maintain our sense of power or agency in the presence of shame. That doesn't mean we don't get used to it, okay? Don't be fooled. And you probably have already begun to see this, and I've read this in a number of journals. It's like, holy crap, this stuff is everywhere, and it's in my thinking, it's in my relationships. How do I get out? But see, that keeps us stuck, ultimately. Shame does. And that's what I mean when I've talked about and looked at 2 Corinthians 7 when Paul said worldly sorrow versus godly sorrow. Godly sorrow means letting go and being able to have the agency to put both hands on the cookie jar and tip it out versus hanging on, and I've got it, but I can't get out of the cookie jar. And that is the stuckness that I think a lot of times people feel. The other thing that we have to recognize is kind of this key to power. Shame is there is a key to power in terms of personal power versus power over other people. And the power over other people is I will define you or me, and then I'll make you believe that it's your definition. And we have plenty of people in our world that have or have had power over us. They define us. As children, in a lot of cases, when we finally get around to talking about the stained glass self, we don't have any power when we're kids. The adults around us are defining us, but then when we get to be adults, this message or this power over us has been so embedded that we don't even pay attention to it anymore. And usually whoever's the most important person in our world has that voice. So the only way to reclaim any kind of personal power is to deal with this power over thing. Now, this connects up with the thing we talked about with safe people and the thing that we mentioned about boundaries. Because controllers have power over us. And they use that power in either manipulative ways or just aggressive ways. But in a lot of cases, even compliance have some measure of power. They just use it in subtle ways, in covert sort of ways. And so the power over piece is there, and I have to find some way to reclaim my personal power to do things. And usually personal power leads to or is enhanced by freedom. Now, I can tell you from talking about such things for a long time, even to back when we had these things called Sunday school classes, and I looked at a group of adults and said, you have the freedom to do anything you want. And you would have thought that I had a herd of deer and I just shone a bunch of light into their eyes. Because it had never, ever occurred to them that they truly do have the freedom to do whatever they want. We do. I mean, I could say you have all the freedom in the world to walk out of this classroom. You do. And some people do. But some people would say, no, I don't. But see, no, I don't is built on certain values as far as what constrains you and your freedom. And that's entirely up to you. But you have the freedom to do what you want. But there are certain things that constrain us. So the personal power is defined as the ability to act, to have personal agency in the world around us, to produce some kind of effect on people and ourselves, or our world, I should say. And it's not a zero sum. See, the culture we're living in, we have been massively impacted by the culture we live in. And the culture we live in would have us believe that power is a zero-sum game. In other words, if I have all the power, then you have none of it. Zero sum. And that's not true. That fundamentally is not true. Now, the person who says I have all the power may have weapons and other things to coerce me into that, but it's not a zero-sum game. And that's true for a lot of our lives, but we've gotten sold a bill of goods that says if somebody has something and I don't, then I'll never have it. Or that, God's blessings is a zero-sum game. If some people get a lot of it and I get a little of it, that makes sense. It's balanced. So this whole thing can be developed and built into the relationship with others. It's not necessary to take away from others in order to have any in your relationship. As a matter of fact, I may have a fair amount of power in the relationships I have, but most of my efforts are to empower the people I'm in relationship with to take their personal power. And sometimes that's hard to do because of how we've been conditioned and because of a lot of things, just assumptions we make. It can be for a lot of reasons that we actually don't do that. But I have to have some measure of awareness of the choices I have. And from those choices, then I can begin to do some things differently and to change things. Most of the time, we just simply dismiss the choices we have because we have already projected into the future as to what the outcomes will be, and those choices are unacceptable then. I don't think anybody that I've talked to, myself included, has any 100% hitting rate, or 1,000 if you're a baseball fan, batting average with the future. If we did, well, I don't know about you guys, but I'd be famously rich and living on 33,000 square feet, just like Tom Brady. But the reality is we don't. But we do a lot of predicting of the future and predicating our choices today built on our predictions of the future as if it's true. And so the idea of personal power leads into a lot of discussion around consciousness and choice and change. And usually when shame hits, we're not conscious of what we are feeling or why, because we really haven't developed a language around it. We talked about vocabulary the other day. And so we may experience shame, like we've already talked about, in terms of guilt or confusion or fear or anger or judgment or any of these that are on this list. That's how we experience shame. But we don't label it as that. Now, obviously, exposing yourselves to a class like this, suddenly you begin to develop a different vocabulary. And being able to actually identify what it is that I'm feeling and what is it connected to. But ultimately, when shame hits, we're thrown into a crisis and we move into what oftentimes is referred to as survival mode. We're not thinking about the future, we're thinking about getting out of the situation I'm in right now. And that's what survival is really all about, is getting out of the situation I'm in, preserving my safety, preserving my security, but I'm not thinking at all about what the future may hold or what kinds of things are going to happen in the next few days. All I'm worried about is what is confronting me right now. And so Brown refers to the brain research that this idea of shame is so threatening that rather than processing it by thinking about it, analyzing it, being rational about it, it moves into this more primal amygdala type of reaction of fight, flight, or freeze. Now, the one thing that you don't see a lot of, or we don't seem to talk nearly as much about, and when we talk about trauma, we talk about this a fair amount, is we got the fight or flight piece. But we don't understand the freeze part of it, where we're kind of paralyzed to do anything, and so we're stuck in place. Fighting, obviously, is very clear. It energizes us. It moves us towards solution. There are people that tend toward one or the other of these. Generally, if we feel so overwhelmed and so outmatched, what do? We hunker down, and we say, "I'll just take the hits that I need, get out of this situation, and then assess my wounds and move on." And that's what survival really is all about. And there's a good bit of that happens, particularly in the time that we're in, with pandemics, for example. I noticed that in a lot of my groups that were part of the grief and loss class last spring. We got thrown into complete chaos because now suddenly we had to be online, and instead of doing groups and looking each other in the eye in real time, we had to do it by Zoom. And I saw any one of these responses. People would launch into getting their schedule worked out and get everything laid out and everything clean and everything. It's part of the fight. And there are plenty of people that just ran away from it and binged on Netflix for a whole week or whatever it would be. And then there are those that just didn't do anything. they shut down. And that's the freeze response that we're talking about. And we still cycle through that because we're in the middle of this stuff. We get reminded. I was walking in the office with Bontrager when she got out of her class, and she said, would we have ever thought in last year that we would be walking around with masks on all the time? It's unthinkable. And so we've gotten acclimated to it, but I don't know that we've owned it or even allowed ourselves to actually be a part of it. So that's a good portion, okay? And that's basically kind of a review of what we've done with Brown with some of the added additions that I have for you. What I want to move into is something, and I add this, is the material you're about to hear is extremely intrusive, so continue at your own risk. I have a variety of material that I'm bringing in from a guy by the name of Lewis Smedes. Lewis Smedes was a professor at Biola. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Saxby had him for a professor, so he's as old as dirt, just like Saxby. And he wrote a book that I stole the title from, Shame and Grace. Thank you very much, Dr. Smedes. But there are things in that book that I want to introduce you to that are kind of an extension of what you've been reading from Brené Brown, and that's part of what this is. So where we go is, what I want to talk about is what I call the leading candidates for shame. And what I mean by that is not the leading candidates of being a target of shame, but the leading candidates of people and how we deal with our shame, okay? So this is a little bit like the groups that we talked about in Safe People, or the specific kinds of boundary problems people often have. There is never, ever one person who's only one of these. And I lovingly refer to these as the dirty dozen of guilt responses, or shame responses, I should say. So Lewis Smedes it's coming from his book, and then obviously I add my own commentary from my own experience. But the first group of people are the ones that tend to spread the guilt around. They live from this shame equation of one act and one bad person. All you have to do is one bad thing, and it makes you bad thereafter. I did, therefore I am. One lie, you become a liar. See, this translation that occurs in people that would fall into this category of guilt spreaders is they spread the guilt, or maybe better yet, they spread the shame to all of their person. That's what we mean by this, okay? So the shame spreaders, guilt spreaders, they make a mistake, and now they're, I walk down these halls, I hear plenty of people talking, and somebody's apologizing to somebody else because they did something, and inevitably what I hear is, I'm the worst. That's guilt spreading. So I did something wrong, I did something that hurt the person, and I'll do what I can to make it right. But instead I say, but I'm the worst. And man, if you're the worst, where do you go from there? Okay, so guilt spreaders, shame spreaders is one example. Another one is the people that are overly responsible. They feel as if they, not God, have the whole world in their hands, as the song goes. They are responsible for everything that is around them, and everyone that is around them, and how they choose and what they do and all of that sort of stuff. And everything that goes badly in the lives of the people around them is a reflection of them. This is kind of a classic personalization thing of their worth and their responsibility. And generally what they say is, if only I had known, if only I had done, if only I should have done this or that or the other thing. So the overly responsible are taking responsibility way out beyond their boundaries. Okay? And so remember what we talked about with the boundaries thing and the fencing that we have around our heart, around the things that we're responsible for. But what overly responsible people do is they say, okay, I get this with the boundary around my heart and what I'm responsible for, but I'm also responsible for all neighbors in all directions around me and the things that they do and the choices they make and everything else. Why? Because I am influential in people's lives, and therefore I am responsible for the choices they make. My wife and I had a conversation last night, and our next door neighbor, I think some of you know this, is my grandsons. Well, their parents too, but easy for me to say, a yard sign showed up in their front yard. Okay, this is really good, and I'm not going to tell you what's on it because it really doesn't matter. But my wife comes in and says, I feel like this is directed at us. It's like, how? I mean, the last I checked, it doesn't say on the sign, oh, this is for the Mitches, this is directed right at the Mitches. And it's like, well, you don't know that. Yeah, but that's how it feels. Oh, there it is. The major ground of all truth is how it feels. And that's the overly responsible part of my wife. She is a great teacher. She takes responsibility for virtually everything. And I tread very carefully because, of course, if I don't eat right or something, suddenly she's being a bad cook. Or see how that works? Guilt spreaders, overly responsible. Man, they're fun to be around because they take the guilt for all the things you don't do. So it's always nice to have those kind of people, hey, if only you had, So, the overly responsible. Another one. I'm sorry, a few more characteristics to make everybody uncomfortable. They have this sense of chronic too muchness. In other words, I'm too much for people. Or they feel like there's just not enough of me to handle this stuff. And really, they have a hard time believing that God has got everything under control. Again, what's our definition of God having everything under control? I mean, we got to define that, right? Because if famine and disaster and hurricanes and wildfires, is that under control? I'm the definer of what's under control. And I've got to be mindful of how I'm defining this stuff. So ultimately, by their behavior, they don't trust God to act as they think he should, and therefore they take it upon themselves to do what he should be doing. It betrays a set of beliefs that never get articulated about God's sovereignty. They may do the lip service about God's sovereignty, but they act as if he's very limited. Maybe he's just a doddering idiot in heaven that kind of falls asleep at the wheel, and I have to pick up the wheel for him. And see, that I know that sounds really harsh, but in a lot of cases, we end up acting like that way if we tend to have this idea around being responsible for everything. And generally, they always have this sense of urgency to getting things done. Is that bad? No, the sense of urgency is not the issue. The motivation of the sense of urgency is the issue. And that's what we have to talk about and look at clearly. So the next one are the obsessive moralizers. This would be an overlap with the critics that we were talking about in the safe people. They see everything in very black and white categories, all or nothing. Right or wrong. And again, in a lot of cases, folks are not necessarily saying it openly that they're this way, but watching their reaction tells me what I need to know. So life is never simply to be experienced. It must always be measured, weighed, evaluated to see if it's morally sound. And oftentimes they end up feeling very much the same way when custom is violated. So how we do things, traditions, versus the violation of conscience. In a lot of cases, these folks oftentimes conflate custom and conscience together. So the moralizers are oftentimes they are very outspoken. Generally, they will give you a piece of their mind that they can ill afford to lose, particularly when it comes to morality. And and so they see things very clearly. And in a lot of cases, even with the critics, sometimes they're really pretty useful, if you want to put it that way. But they're really good at detecting things that aren't morally sound, because that's really their kind of forte. On the other hand, the question is what do they do with human weakness or human flaws or human shortcomings? Because if everything is right or wrong, morally right or wrong, then does that mean that when I'm flawed and my humanity shows, I'm wrong or bad? Because they also think good and bad. So these folks oftentimes are framing everything in this particular way. Now, when we talked about critics and the safe people, remember what we said about them. They're really good at noticing or looking for things that can be corrected instead of looking for ways to connect. And moralizers do that too, because when people are around them, they end up feeling pretty guilty most of the time, because they're always doing something wrong, it would seem like to most people. So the obsessive moralizers is kind of another group of people, if you will, for shame. The other ones is the compulsive comparers. Again, I said to you before that shame shame is the issue and comparison is the tool for shame. And so they are forever comparing themselves against somebody more successful than them. They say, well, I'm just striving to be better. No, probably you're striving to be perfect or better than the person that you're comparing to. There's always a comparison point, generally, that is lurking in what a lot of people say. And even when they compare to themselves and say, well, I was a lot better last year. Well, okay, that's great. I mean, that's good progress. But then if they use it as a bludgeoning weapon against themselves for how bad they are, then what do we result? What's the result? So ultimately, because of the zero sum, all right, success is a really good example. Success is a zero sum thing. So if one person gets a success around them, then that means they're a failure, because that person is their reference point. And success is a zero-sum thing. If somebody gets it, I don't. And so ultimately the heart of the person who is in this category of comparing is the heart of envy, in defining good as what I do not possess and hating the good it has. And that's behind the motivation behind a lot of our comparison. I mean, I don't compare to things that are about the same as what I have. I usually compare to something that is better than what I have, and then make that kind of my target. And that's another part. So each one of these people that I'm highlighting for you are candidates for being impacted by shame. Okay? That also means that if I'm impacted by shame because of one of these characteristics, my tendency is probably to perpetuate it outside of myself too. It's always this inside-outside thing that is going on when we talk about it. Another one, which I'm sure will, if you aren't already uncomfortable, here's another one, and that's approval addicts. And approval addicts, as the name implies, is no matter who they are around, that they really can't approve of themselves unless there is enough people who approve of them. Now, enough is never defined. What is enough? How many people? How much approval? But the funny thing about this is the number is always increasing. If they're highly approved, supported, whatever, by a half dozen people around them, then they say, yeah, but what about a bigger group? I mean, that is it. that's when I'll feel like I actually matter. So they always seem to be fishing for approval. It doesn't mean that they don't, they do that openly. They don't. But in a lot of cases, and we find ourselves doing this, is we troll for others' responses in light of their approval or disapproval. The worst thing about social media is the comparison culture and the approval culture that they precipitate and perpetuate. So we have it in terms of likes or dislikes or thumbs up or thumbs down or whatever that might be. And again, this is one of these zero-sum games. If I don't have approval, it means I am disapproved of. And so they think in very all or nothing terms, a little bit like the obsessive moralizers we were talking about earlier. So approval addicts may not even be all that aware of how much they're trolling, the word I'm using here, how much I'm sensitized to whether people approve of me or not. And even asking the bigger question, how do I know? And so I think ultimately with like the groups that will be coming by the end of the month, ultimately that's what groups confront us with, is that we have people we don't know and we make conclusions about how they feel about us in terms of approval or doing the comparison. Somebody is far better at saying something than I am. I'll just let them talk or whatever that might be. So the approval addicts, the next one is the people that fall in the category of never deserving anything. I think of a lot of things that I oftentimes say and that I struggle with is when people say something nice or they do something nice for me and I say I don't deserve it. And ultimately the sense of deserving something means that I feel like I've done something in trade for what I'm getting. So these folks don't believe that they deserve anything good. They have made that conclusion. And they oftentimes, because they've made this conclusion, they end up sabotaging good when they have it. And so they're picking fights or testing people's motives or distancing themselves from others to see if they'll chase them down or pursue them. And see, a lot of these things we have no idea that we're doing. A lot of times we don't recognize the patterns that are there until maybe somebody like me articulates it, and then it's like, oh crap, now I see it. Yeah, Maya.
Do they distance from others because they want to see if the other person thinks that they're good enough to pursue?
Well, yeah, the pursuit implies that they're good enough. So, they distance and then wait to see, and the reality is that, I could distance from somebody and then they don't come and I say, I'm not worth anything or I'm not worth that much for them to not come after me. On the other hand, there may be all sorts of circumstances that go into that. And eventually the person does. And what happens with these folks is that when the person finally comes around and says, I haven't seen you for a while, what's going on? And they think, they don't say this, but they think, well, if you really cared, you would have showed up when I left. So there's this distance again, and the approval thing. So a lot of times they end up, as we've been talking with other things, this Messiah complex. They keep doing things for people because they don't deserve anything, but certainly other people do. And so they rationalize a lot of this as a means of saving other people. And you see a lot of health service people in this category. They will have heaped onto them all sorts of praise by what they do. But it never gets in. I mean, the never deserving is a little bit like water on a duck's back. It rolls right off and never really hits the mark because they never think that they're good enough. And that goes back to the bigger question we started with in the class, They don't think they're good enough for anything. So therefore, anything that comes to them, they're going to find a way kind of to dismiss it or diminish it or dilute it or any number of things. Okay? Another category of people condemned by memories of the past. Yeah, Sid?
Kind of about the never deserving. It just kind of has me thinking about Christian culture and how I feel like we tend to perpetuate the idea of, like, we don't deserve anything good.
Right.
And I'll hear a lot of times people be like, well, like, we don't deserve blessings, but, like, God still gives them to us.
Yeah.
Do you think that can be an unhealthy message to send?
Yeah, I think it's certainly in the Christian culture, you know, you're right. In the absolute sense, the grace we're given is something we don't deserve. But then that not embracing it is a rejection of the gift that we've been given. So I think the net effect is the only way to really to display being a good Christian is never deserving anything, because that's my ultimate condition anyway. But that, I don't think, and that's not living as, you know, like we like to say, you know, that's not living as the child of the king. It's living as the pauper, making believe that I'm not really a child of the king because I didn't deserve it. So, yeah, I think that shoots through a lot of Christian culture. I mean, it's the same idea of, like what we do with pride, and when we're proud of something we've accomplished, in a lot of cases we counterbalance it with or diminish it somehow by saying, you know, well, it's all God and all that, and that's true. I'm not debating that, but I don't think that the correction for pride is self-loathing, and that's oftentimes where we end up. So yeah, I think from a practical standpoint, it shows up in certainly the Christian culture for sure. So, being condemned by the memories of our past, we carry these along, and they end up defining us. And this provides a foothold for shame. Certainly, if the memories of the past or the past behaviors or things like that has been shot through with shame. I mean, we ultimately, when we do things and experience things that we regret, shame is just waiting at the door, if it already doesn't bust down the door, to say, see, this is what makes you a bad person. You don't deserve anything good or anything like that, which makes being in good relationships really difficult. I've had this conversation with my oldest daughter many times over, and she finally got around to getting married. And he, you know, he's a good guy. He really is a good guy. But there were many times when they were dating and engaged that I said, don't sabotage the good you've been given because of what you believe about yourself. And the nature of your past and all of those things. And that stuff comes along with us. And it really informs a lot of our reactions and interactions with people around us. So there are lots of times where parents are susceptible to this. Now, what I mean by that is because of what they experienced as kids, then they correct that from the things that they've done wrong in the past as parents, or their parents have done wrong or whatever, is inevitably the parenting philosophy is always on a pendulum swing. So if you grew up with people that were overly strict, your tendency probably is to go the other direction, to correct for it, which means you're probably a little bit more lenient or a lot more lenient because you didn't, you know, you resented all the strictness. And so there's always these pendulum swings that people get into, even in parenting. And that, when I say parents are susceptible, not only in terms of how they go about parenting, but the mistakes they made as parents and the impact it has on their relationship with their kids later. And so they end up walking away feeling like they're not deserving of their kids' love or whatever that might be that comes along with it. And then the couple more. One is discounting our positives. Again, this is one of these things where Christianity oftentimes works. is you hear a compliment and find a way to dismiss it. People are just being nice. They if they knew me the way I know me, they wouldn't like me either, but they don't, so therefore they're being overly kind. And they might even add that the things that people are complimenting them about are things that nobody really cares about either anyway. So there's a variety of kind of mental gymnastics the person engages in terms of trying to diminish the positive of what's going on, versus what's the alternative. If I embrace the grace that's offered me, which is also offered in people's appreciation and love and care, then what's the alternative reaction to it? And that is learn to live in it and relish it and take it in and experience it and be a part of all of that. And sometimes that's really hard to do because of the beliefs we have, similar to what we talked about here, that we really haven't identified. And that's part of the landscape, and that also puts me in a position to experience even more shame. And then the last one, I think it's the last one here, is the idea of magnifying my flaws. One way to have what people offer me, and whatever that might be, is to magnify all the things that are bad about me or the flaws that I have. And so anything less than a stunning success is a miserable failure. That it's very much all or nothing thinking. There's a lot of overlap, I might remind you, between these kind of groups of people that we're talking about today. There's a lot of overlap. And sometimes people can switch roles. We've been talking about that in Safe People, and we talked about that in Boundaries too, is that people can show these characteristics in different settings and in different ways. And ultimately, any surface flaw, which this should sound vaguely familiar, right? Because we go up to the very first one where they say one bad behavior makes one bad person. The same thing with these folks that are magnifying their flaws. Any surface flaws are blown up into a bigger thing that is the reason for their lack of acceptance or acceptability. So they magnify their flaws. A few other characteristics that go along with this. Christians, since their human goodness amounts to nothing in compared to God's goodness, means that they are absolutely nothing. And even some of our hymns seem to suggest this. So the least of the weaknesses outweigh the greatest of their strengths, and there's always this kind of push-pull. They may begrudgingly admit that they have some strengths, but the things that they spend a lot of their time thinking about are where they lack, what their inadequacies are, and the nature of each one of those things. So I've got a few more, but I think I'm going to stop here and let you begin to absorb some of these things. Any questions? Any clarifications needed? Yes, Sid?
This kind of makes me think about how when people get complimented, they're like, oh no, well I'm this. And
Yeah.
Kind of revert to their flaws.
Yep.
Do you think when people say things like, oh, I'm just not good at taking compliments, that's shame-based?
It can be. It certainly can be. I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, that's for sure the case. But I think when somebody is complimenting another person and they spend a lot of time trying to reduce it or dilute it or distort it somehow, and they think that's the Christian thing to do because they would fall into pride, then I think, yeah, probably it's got some shame running through it somehow, versus the person that somebody says something nice or complimentary, and they say thank you. They appreciate the person making the effort to say that kind of stuff, and that's kind of relishing the grace that's being offered you. I mean, when people say thank you, or are kind, or compliment things you do, I mean, one way to look at it, because we live in a world that's saturated by God, it's grace being offered you. and it's just a human delivery system. So, I mean, people don't have to do that. They really don't. There's nothing that says somebody has to say anything nice at all. And if I believe in choice, then I believe in choice. And when people do something, they chose to do that. And that choice is a significant one. So yeah, I think if they're trying to diminish it somehow, then there's probably some motivation, shame motivation in there somewhere. And it's lurking in all of us. We don't have to look very far. It's not that. You can just assume that it's there. But then if you're assuming that and go looking for it, then don't fall into some of these patterns where it's like, see, I told you so. You really do deserve all of this crap that you're heaping on yourself about it. So, any other questions? Yeah, Maya?
Do you think some of these are kind of tied into foreboding joy?
Oh, yeah. No, I think so, right? I mean, the idea that when's the next shoe going to drop because something bad, every time I get something good, something bad is going to happen. So absolutely. I think they're in various ways kind of working with that. Some of them are a relational pattern that shows up rather than a statement that people say. And that's what I think Smedes is trying to capture with some of these, is what's the relational stance the person is in, and what are they trying to kind of hedge their bets against, and it's that other shoe dropping. So I think that's what made that concept that Brene Brown talks about so compelling, because it captures immediately what a lot of people probably do in a variety of ways because people are all different. So absolutely, I think that's a good connection to make. Any other questions or anything? Okay, well, we'll let you chew on that over the weekend, and we'll be back to do some more. See ya. See ya, Zoomers.